This is the Multi-Faith Matters podcast. I'm your host, John Moorhead. Well, this is the podcast for Multi-Faith Matters, and I'm the host, John Moorhead, and I'm privileged today to have as my guest a scholar whose work I've been following for a while, and I'll describe how that fits into my background. My guest is Dr. Kurt Gray, and he is a social psychologist and an award-winning researcher and teacher who uses an interdisciplinary method to study our deepest held beliefs and how to bridge moral divides. And I can't think of anything more needed in America today, whether in religion or in politics. Dr. Gray is an associate professor in psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he directs the deepest beliefs lab. And I was geeking out when I found that in preparation for our discussion today. Lots of resources there. And the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. And I will include links to all of this in the program notes for folks who can follow along. He's also an adjunct associate professor in organizational behavior at the, hopefully I'm going to pronounce this correctly, Keenan-Flagler?
Yeah.
Okay. Business School at UNC, where he teaches about organizational ethics and team processes. Dr. Gray received his PhD from Harvard University. Dr. Gray, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Of course. I just want to kind of share with you, and for those who regularly watch this podcast will be familiar with this, but many won't, as to how your work in harm-based morality and social psychology came on my radar. For a number of years, I've been interested in the dynamics of multi-faith conflict and why it is that conservative Christians tend to either keep other religions at bay, just ignore them, or more often than not engage in these confrontational kinds of interactions and approaches. And for conservative Christians, everything boils down to theology, but I think that's misguided. I wanted to understand the psychological processes that was going on within the conservative Christian mind that was then resulting in these kind of negative theological approaches. And so I got 2 grants from the Louisville Institute. And the second grant took our theology and put it into conversation with social psychology. And it was at that time that I encountered the work of Dr. Jonathan Haidt and moral foundations theory. And we had an advisory group of scholars that helped us do our own psychological research. And my theory at the time, which didn't pan out, was that disgust was what was going on, that Christians were disgusted by the possibility of being exposed to heresy. And what we discovered in our research was that Christian nationalism was actually a greater predictor than disgust was. But along the course of that research in moral foundations theory and disgust and so on, I came across your work in harm-based morality, and I've been fascinated by it. We did a book at the end of our research looking at the emotions of multi-faith engagement. And in my chapter, not only did I discuss moral foundations theory and disgust as a possibility, I also mentioned your work as well. So here, all of that is background. Here we are today. I'd like to begin with a little personal note. How did you personally and professionally get interested in the kind of research that you're doing now?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so professionally, I kind of got here by having an advisor who was interested in the problem of other minds. So that's a longstanding philosophical issue, right? Like, you have a mind, you can feel emotions and feel pain, but you don't know anyone else can have experiences, right? It's like Descartes' kind of original insight, right? Like, he knows he's around because, I think therefore I am, right? He's a mind, but there's this kind of like ultimate gap between our mind and those of others, and we're left to guess other people's experience, right? If your spouse says, "I love you," how do you know if they mean it, right? That time, or ever for that matter, right? And so it's a really deep problem, and it also relates actually to a lot of theological things. So proposed one grant on discernment, right? The process of discernment as people try to understand God's voice, and it's always filtered through our own psychology, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's ultimately a question of like understanding the mind of God. And so I've got actually a number of things on kind of how people understand the mind of God. But then in terms of my work on bridging divides, I'd say personally, I grew up in Canada, the kind of Texas of Canada, Alberta. So I'm kind of like grew up a little more conservative for Canada, but Canada's a little more progressive for America. And I've got a lot of family. My stepmother's family is from Nebraska, and they're all quite conservative, evangelicals, all of them. And so it was interesting as a kid, I had so much in common with them in terms of we like swimming in the pond, we like riding horses around their farm, right? Playing in the barn, right? Like as a kid, everything in common. And then as I grew older and I, hung out more with academics and they hung out more with other evangelical Christians, it was clear that we kind of disagreed on a lot of issues, politically speaking. And I wanted to know, but I always respected them, right? I always respected them. We always had fairly reasonable conversations. But I understood that is not the norm in America, and not even the norm, in even my small bubbles and their bubbles as well. And so I wanted to understand kind of how to kind of better bridge those conversations, not only for, understanding America at large and gridlock Congress, but also for having just better conversations with family members, better Thanksgiving dinners. So that's kind of my personal connection. And that kind of one of my forays, maybe this links up to the kind of things we'll be talking about into harm-based morality and politics and religion, was this op-ed I published in the New York Times in 2015. And it was about evangelical reactions to the likely passage of gay marriage. And at the time, kind of mirroring your approach, right, your initial approach on moral foundations theory, people, academics, even kind of more religious folks were like, look, the reason that many Christians are against the passage of gay marriage is because just of scripture or because of disgust. And my research suggests, well, even in things that seem, quote, harmless or victimless, there's still a kind of powerful presence of harm in our minds. And that kind of motivates our moral judgment. And so we ran a bunch of studies that found that even in ostensibly harmless actions, for instance, entertaining heresy, if you're a Christian, right, that people still see harm in those acts, right? See potential victims, see the suffering of children, see the degrading of society in some ways. And so we published this op-ed in the Times saying that, look, there's a kind of constant presence of victimhood in this opposition to gay marriage, right? Perceiving like children as being harmed, families as unraveling. And, whether you agree with that or not, the point is that these perceptions on behalf of evangelicals are legitimately held and authentically believed. And so we got a lot of great emails from evangelicals about this, right? Some pastor down south said, thank you for recognizing my opinions and my perspective. And I'm not just, just inventing this just to piss off liberals on the other hand.
Right.
And the liberals, for their part, were mostly like, I don't believe it, right? But this is the entire, right? It's hard to speak to divides, right?
Right.
But the point was that, well, you should believe it, right? And just because you don't see the harm, doesn't mean that other people don't. And what we argued is really there's a connection between seeing something as immoral and seeing it as harmful. And if you see it as immoral, then you see it as harmful, and vice versa. And if you don't, then you don't. But the important point is, like, you have to recognize those other perceptions.
Yeah, I appreciate all that background. Just a little quick follow-up on that. I notice in our conversation, you're wearing glasses. I have contact lenses on. You talked about trying to identify filters. And I would think that our filters would be self-evident, but we also call them blind spots. Are basically a big part of your work trying to help people identify their own blind spots, as well as what they don't see in the other in terms of your research?
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of putting it, right? Our minds are full of biases, right? We function in the world in a way to kind of help us get through easily and quickly, and not necessarily to find the kind of ultimate truth in others, especially, right? To recognize the value in other people's viewpoints. And so we're blinded in many ways about other people and their perspectives. And so my work does try to reveal one, the kind of truth that other people have that you might not realize, and ways to appreciate that more fully.
Now, your work is in, we've been talking about harm-based morality. For those who've never heard of that concept, can you define it and unpack it for us?
Sure. It's a pretty simple idea, which is that when our moral mind makes judgments, those judgments are ultimately grounded in harm. And so, give you an obvious example. So if you see someone abusing their kid, right, or kicking their dog, we think that those actions are harmful and also immoral, right? They're immoral because we see them as harmful. And that's uncontroversial with a lot of things, right? 95% of the laws in America are built to guard against harm, theft, assault, abuse, whatever, right? Fraud, those are all that kind of harm. But the idea of harm-based morality is that kind of like harm-based core of morality, things that we all typically believe are immoral and harmful, that extends more broadly, and that all of our kind of moral judgments are ultimately grounded in harm. And of course, there are other things that matter as well, right? Questions of, you can say theology or family, right? Other values, but even those other values are ultimately kind of further grounded in harm, right? So if scripture says to do something or don't do something, right, it's often understood that's not just like God saying that by fiat, right, but instead God saying that to protect us from harm or guide us in a more kind of beneficial path, right? And so all those things ultimately come together in harm. And the nice thing about it is if we all have it, we can all ultimately make sense of moral differences, because, right, we all ultimately have the same kind of common currency, right? You travel to Greece, you need to buy something, right? You can exchange your money, right? We all have an exchange rate. And so the idea is that harm is the kind of like common currency of morality. No matter what values you hold, you can kind of exchange those values through harm.
In preparing for our conversation, I worked my way through various journal articles that you've written over the years and pulled out some questions. And coming out of what you just said, it would seem to me that one of the challenges that we face in this is defining the term harm. You refer to it that it's best understood as spanning an intuitively perceived continuum. How does that definition and that continuum play into harm-based morality?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think that the simplest way of understanding harm is that it's really a pairing of two people. So it's not stubbing your toe. It's not, right, hitting your head when you get up in the night, although that, it's harmful, but really it's this kind of interpersonal harm. So one person harming another, a victimizer and a victim is kind of like the psychological model we have in our minds. That's what harm is for morality. And the intuitive part is it's not something we generally have to think about really hard, right? You don't have to look at someone kicking their dog and think, oh, like I wonder if there's a victim here, and I wonder if there's a victimizer, right? You just see the dog yelping and a man like gritting his teeth as he's kicking, and you just think that's harmful and that's immoral. So the intuitive part's important because a lot of research in morality has revealed that our moral judgments are really kind of like almost emotional, right? They are made quickly and without a lot of consideration. And so our perceptions of harm are that way as well. They kind of mirror morality. And then the continuum part, I think, is also important. And this gets into kind of like academic debates. I don't know how much we want to get into, right? But there's this big argument in the field, and it's gone on for a long time, about the existence of harmless wrongs, right? And so if there are things that are wrong that people think are harmless, like breaking promises to the dead, for instance, right? People think that that's often wrong, but they say, well, it's harmless. And so if there are things that are immoral that don't involve harm, then logically speaking, it must be the case that harm can't be the basis for all of morality, right? Because we have a harmless wrong, and so there must be something else. And so to the kind of issue of harmless wrongs, my response is, well, harmless to whom? Right? Because if harm is kind of in the eyes of the beholder, then if someone sees it as harmful, then it is harmful to them, right? So back to gay marriage, right? So if you're an evangelical and you see gay marriage as harmful, then it is harmful to you, right? And that's what I mean by harm is perceived. And as far as the intuitive continuum goes, to say that something's harmless but immoral kind of cuts the rich kind of continuum, right, diversity of harm in two, right? The harms and the not harms, the wrongs and the not wrongs. But in fact, like it proceeds along a gradient, right? So genocide is a wrong, but so is, I don't know, double parking. So is going 20 over the speed limit. Is it as bad as genocide? I don't think so, right? There's clearly a difference there, but it doesn't mean that one is not wrong and one is wrong, right? And so when we talk about the harmfulness of breaking promises to the dead, it's certainly not as harmful as kicking a dog or lying, right, to your spouse, or, you know, betrayal. But I think you can say it is harmful in the fact that what if everyone lied, right? Or what does that mean for like people who are dying, right? It harms them as they're hoping that their dreams are carried forward, and other people, right, don't follow those dreams, right? So you can kind of see it as harmful in a sense, intuitively, even if it's not as harmful as something like murder. So I think those are the important parts in my work that I've tried to highlight as we've kind of engaged in these academic debates.
So what you're describing here, this is a human psychological thing, not just a conservative versus liberal. Sometimes I run into that when I start describing the relevance of some of this to interreligious conflict. It's not we all have this harm-based morality. We're just disagreeing, conservative, liberal, for example, over what is harmful, and there's no understanding or recognition that what the other on the other side of the aisle thinks is harmful is laughed off as ridiculous on the other side. And because it's not taken seriously, the other many times is just considered evil, rather than having a disagreement over what's harmful for the individual and society. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the kind of what draws me to this idea of a harm-based morality is, one, I think it's true, right? I've done lots of studies where the results suggest that we kind of have this common currency. But two, I think it's useful, and I think it has the potential to help bridge divides. And so you mentioned kind of moral foundations theory, and that's, you know, a quite popular theory in my field as well, right? So the idea that there's a number of distinct moral foundations, and liberals have a couple, and conservatives have more, and liberals will never understand those foundations, right? And so I think the issue pragmatically with that theory is it means that there is an unbridgeable moral divide, in the sense that, like, you know, if you don't have that foundation, you'll never understand conservatives, right? Like liberals never understand what it's like to respect authority. And one, I don't think that's true. I have two kids, and you can bet I get plenty pissed when I tell them to do something and they don't do something, right? And loyalty, right? And you know, if you want to talk about purity, if you know someone who cares about like getting the freshest juices into their body after a yoga cleanse, it's probably not an evangelical conservative, it's a liberal. But I think the point that you made is very apt, in that we all have our kind of conceptions of harm, even if we all, right? And I guess I want to back up and say, look, we agree on 95% of harms already, right? We agree on the importance of protecting our kids. We agree on not wanting to like drink poisoned water, on having cars that don't kill us, on, right? Like there is so much agreement in our lives about morality. And I think we often don't discuss it, but I think we should start there, right? We all think that it's bad to abuse kids, you know, to embezzle from our companies, to lie to our spouse, whatever. So we agree on those things. But when we disagree, I think we often, as you say, neglect the legitimate assumptions of harm that people make about those things. And so if you're an evangelical, you probably believe in something like an immortal soul, right? And the existence of an afterlife. And for secular atheists, right, if you don't believe in a soul, then you can see many kind of things that an evangelical might do as being strange or ridiculous, right? Like worrying about your immortal salvation. But like if you believe in a soul and you think that that soul persists for an eternity, you know, Pascal's wager, then it makes sense to safeguard that soul and those of your children's forever, right? So I think once you recognize that all morality is based in harm and people make different assumptions about that harm, then you're not as much arguing about who's evil, but about the assumptions that people are making about what is or isn't harmful. And then if we're arguing about these kind of assumptions, then it's more of an opportunity to learn and discuss our kind of, where we're coming from, and not saying that like, well, you're evil and I'm not. And so my hope is that, again, pragmatically, that understanding this common currency will help us better bridge divides.
Could you say a little bit about the relationship between harm-based morality and moral foundations theory? Are you saying that they have a relationship, or that moral foundations theory is an inappropriate way to understand the psychology, and harm-based is kind of a wholesale alternative? For those who are more familiar, perhaps, with Jonathan Haidt and his colleagues and their assertions and their body of work, what's the relationship there?
Yeah, it's a good question. And Haidt and I have had a number of debates about this, both in print and in person. And so I think there are maybe two ways of thinking about it. If you think about moral foundations as just an interesting description of some values, and some very specifically understood values that liberals and conservatives might disagree on, then I think they are compatible theories, because my theory is about the kind of the underlying basis of the moral mind, right? Kind of cognition. And moral foundations theory is about kind of describing the world. But, and some kind of variability, some differences that might exist. But even then, I think that some of those foundations are not measured well. So, for instance, if you are going to measure loyalty with questions about respecting what your pastor says, caring about your particular sports team, or worrying about kind of, what someone does with the American flag, those are about loyalty, absolutely, but they're kind of designed in a way to really tack more conservative concerns about loyalty, right? One could imagine designing those questions to be about loyalty to union leaders, or to the words of Martin Luther King Jr., or right, a number of ways that you could kind of make it a little more left-leaning, and then you would come away saying, well, it's actually liberals that care more about loyalty. You could say the same thing about authority, right? So that there's ways in which the kind of framing of those foundations is skewed in a way that I think misrepresents kind of the divide between liberals and conservatives. But I think the idea of a general harm-based morality is consistent with the idea of kind of like looking at various ways that liberals and conservatives might disagree. If you think of moral foundations as like cognitive foundations, as John's written, switches in the brain, right? Kind of these modules, then I think that I firmly disagree that there are those things in the mind. So there's no good evidence that there are foundations, as kind of John argues in his more essentialist terms, we could say, right? That there are these like things in the mind, and like if they're switched on, then you care about purity, and if they're switched off, then you don't, and culture switches them on or off. We don't have those kind of like separate circuits or separate little modules in our mind. Instead, we kind of have these like distributed kind of general psychological models of the world, and those models are based on harm. And so we have lots of other work that shows that, if you think that loyalty is an important moral value, you link it to harm. And harm is the kind of active ingredient that turns a value, and there's lots of values, punctuality, industriousness, right, respect, whatever. I could name 100 values. We could spend the whole thing this hour naming values, but if you moralize those values, it's because you link them to harm.
Okay, that's helpful as I continue to rethink this. I started with Haidt, and always willing to rethink my understanding of things. I mentioned when we started some work that I had done with a grant, some research in psychology that began with the idea that purity was of great concern to conservative Christians. I certainly still think that is the case. And with that, oftentimes I see anger and fear, particularly for conservative Christians in relation to particular religious groups more than others, Muslims, atheists. If you look at the Pew Feelings Thermometer and about how evangelicals feel about other religious groups, those tend to relate to come down on the bottom of the scale. How does harm-based morality relate to those kinds of concerns for purity?
Yeah, it's a good question. Purity is it's a funny foundation. It's a funny concept. We actually have a big paper under review right now, kind of suggesting that the concept of purity is kind of ill-defined. It's a grab bag of things that you can just throw in whatever doesn't seem to fit in other things. So sometimes purity is defined as very specifically about, let's say, the kind of like soul, right? You're like tarnishing the soul. If you sign a piece of paper to sell your soul, that's impure. But it's sometimes also about sex, right? Having underage sex, that's seen as impure. Sometimes it's about just immorality, right? The impurity of sin, right? Sin in itself renders someone impure, but sin is just a synonym for immorality, right? And so if you understand purity as just being something that's immoral, well, then it's not about purity, it's just about immorality, right? And so it's this weird chimeric shifting construct. And what we find in our studies is when we assess kind of worries about impurity, they are correlated about 0.9, which is basically perfect, right, for a study, with concerns about harm. So why are you concerned about rendering your soul impure? Well, does it make you go to hell? Does it make you become a terrible person, right? Does it turn you into someone you don't want to be? Does it harm your children? Does it harm your community? And I think the same with prejudice against atheists or Muslims or even other sects of Christianity, right? So Protestants versus Catholics for a long time, right? It's like, well, that religion is not only wrong, but think of all the terrible things it leads to, right? If you're a Protestant, like you're giving up your authority to a priest. We all know the abuses of the Catholic Church. And so, right, won't that cause all sorts of harms? And so I think, and I mentioned the study at the beginning where I had, evangelical folks think about impure things, right? Harmless things. So we asked, these are college students, and we sat them in the lab and we said, I want you to think about a series of ideas, and I want you to rate your disgust on how disgusting it feels to think of these ideas, and also how harmful you think it is to have these ideas, and then finally how immoral it is to think these ideas. So we have harm, disgust, and immorality. And so the ideas were things like Jesus is not God, right? God is not real, things like that, right? Heretical ideas. And it turns out that they did feel disgusted entertaining those ideas. They did think that those ideas were harmful, and they did think that those things were immoral. But the key is that disgust led to perceptions of immorality, disgust led to perceptions of harm, which led to perceptions of immorality. So unpacking that, it means disgust is just a cue to harm, and harm is what drives immorality. And if you think about it, it has to be the case that it has to be the case. There's the pets we mentioned. It has to be the case that disgust on its own can't be immoral, right? Because look, I'm a parent, and my children recently got out of diapers, and there were so many days that I was covered in poop, right? My daughter came home with like a stomach bug. This is my 5-year-old. She's a stomach bug, and she's like, oh, Dad, I don't feel well. Oh my God, right? So I like lift her off the couch, like run into the bathroom or throw her in my arms. And at the same time, she threw up on me and had diarrhea, and it came out the back of her pants. And it was disgusting. It was on me, it was on the floor. And did I think it was immoral? Even though I was horribly disgusted, and I, my sense of impurity was surely triggered. But no, I didn't think she was immoral. Right, I felt concern, compassion. I wanted to help her, and so disgust on its own is not enough to make someone think that something's immoral. You have to have that additional concern about harmful. Right, it's disgusting and it's going to cause damage to something I care about, and so that's kind of my thoughts about disgust.
So, was that study that you mentioned? Was that the one where you looked at the harm of sacrilegious ideas? Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, just so the audience can understand this a little bit better, evangelicals and other conservative Christians can understand themselves, and those in other religious traditions can maybe understand something that's going on in the psychology of conservative Christians. You did discover some confirmation that conservative Christians do feel like they are being harmed. Is it just in the mention of, the thinking of, presence of? How far can we take that concern for harm in relation to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And again, going back to the idea that harms is kind of continuum. So, right, all harms are not equal. Surely entertaining the idea that Jesus is not God is not as harmful as cutting off someone's fingers, for instance, right? But there is some kind of felt harm, and I think that folks reported that, well, is it going to like stay inside me, right, and like kind of echo in my mind and give me doubts, undermine my faith. And if my faith is my key to kind of like my moral sense and the fact that I do good deeds instead of bad, will that make me less likely to do bad things? And so it doesn't take that many steps to understand how these sacrilegious thoughts that people are asked to entertain, and not spontaneously, right? And experimenters like think these terrible thoughts, and that's a little more kind of forced, even though it's not really forced, right? Than if you just idly came across these while reading or something. But I think there is truth in the idea that people feel kind of harmed, kind of entertaining these, right? Or the idea of not being able to raise your kids in your religious tradition, right? Like that seems harmful too, right? Because again, if you link your religion to morality, it connects, and you link morality to not doing subsequent harm, right? So having values that support your family and make America better and so forth.
Just so that we can kind of understand the dynamics that's going on here and maybe rehumanize each other in the process. I think many times when we disagree with others over politics and religion, the way it's understood by the person on the other side, well, that person's they're just prejudiced, they're just bigoted. And there may indeed be prejudice and bigotry going on, but is it correct that there's a broader dynamic? The human mind has this us versus them dynamic. We have this implicit bias against outgroup members. And when we perceive harm, in part, a prejudice may be a self-defense mechanism. Maybe prejudice itself can be understood on a continuum as well. Are these kinds of dynamics in play? I'm just trying to help us. We tend to look at the black and white. I disagree with that person. They don't like me, therefore they're evil and bigoted. But there's other things going on.
Yeah, it's a great point. And kind of no matter who you are or what your beliefs are, we have a powerful urge to clump the world into us and them, as you say, right? And us means we are true, we are good, we know what's going on, right? And them is the opposite, right? They don't know what's going on, they're not smart, they're not wise, they're immoral. And so there's all sorts of processes that, right, those things, those beliefs in us and them serve multiple functions. So one, it makes you feel good about yourself, right? And we all have a need to feel good about ourselves, like implicit self-esteem. If your thought was like, our group kind of sucks, right? And their group is great, like that's not a great way to go through life, right? It's like, it's hard for humans to not to feel good about themselves and their groups. And so we feel good about our groups because we want to feel good about ourselves. And we feel bad about others who aren't in our group because we also want to feel good about ourselves. And right, if you constantly were like, wow, like whatever they're doing, that's right, like that's a good way of doing it, then it means that you should change your group, right? And it turns out that's really hard, and you built all this social capital up to belong in your group. And so it's really hard to break out of your group, right? So maybe even if you're evangelical, right, there's other sects where maybe you don't believe in what they're doing, right? And you say maybe they're brainwashed, right? Maybe they don't believe correctly because, right, like their parents just think that, or their pastors like forcing down this interpretation of scripture instead of this other one, right? You can cut the line as fine as you, even in your own congregation, right? Well, right. This person thinks this, that's crazy, right? If you're an atheist, you think it's all crazy, right?
That's right. That's right.
But if you're in the church, right, like the fact that you could like, have schisms over like small disagreements in doctrine that seem really big, if you focus on them. And so I think it's a universal human urge, and it happens at every scale of humankind. And so the trick, and I think that maybe the problem is that when there's big disagreements, we often focus on the big disagreement. So Christians versus Muslims, instead of the fact that the guy who sits in the pew next to me, right, like I think misreads this part of scripture. And so in some sense, we're trying to test this. We're seeing if like focusing on local disagreements, the fact that disagreement is something human, might make you be more amenable to the fact that people disagree about some bigger things, right? We always disagree. That's just how it is, but surely we agree at all levels. So even, right, atheists believe that you should raise good kids, and Muslims believe in God, right? You got to pick the right scale.
Right. To kind of pick up on that, I like to try and end on a positive note. What we've been talking about is identifying a lot of the what and the why. But then that raises questions of how. How do we take the data from this kind of work that you're doing, and how do we apply it to try and move past our polarization? Have you done any work in that area? Would you have any suggestions once we recognize the psychological dynamics that are going on? How can we, in some sense, recognize that the other has concerns for harm that we may not necessarily share, and rather than just saying, you know what, you just need to drop it, how can we recognize the concern without necessarily agreeing with it or baptizing it in Christian terms, and working through the differences for the betterment of the society we live in?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have a couple of projects on this. One of them is about a kind of general misconception we have about bridging divides. So in this project, we asked Americans, right, including evangelicals, conservatives, kind of a representative sample, what would make you respect someone on the other side of the gun debate, let's say. And they say, I want the facts. Give me the facts, right? Like, we'll just have some base facts, and then from those kind of objective truths, we will construct some common ground and then come to some kind of understanding, if not agreement. And then if you give people facts, turns out it does not work. In fact, it sometimes makes things worse, right? Because you're like, those aren't real facts. You can make up your own facts. That's fake news, right? And then, right, and then you just like, you're totally derailed as you're arguing about the facts. It turns out that the key to bridging divides, increasing respect, is about emphasizing personal experiences, particularly those about harm. And that is because we all understand the importance of avoiding harm, and we all understand that other people are motivated to avoid harm. And so if I have a view that you think is not rational because of your assumptions, right? Let's say I'm pro-gun control, you're pro-gun, right? And you say, why don't you want a gun? Don't you want to protect your family, right? That's dumb. And I say, why would you want a gun? Like, do you want your kids to shoot themselves when they find it, right? And so starting that, that conversation there is not going to end well. But it turns out that if we first share stories about how we've been impacted, perhaps by guns or any issue, then it provides a kind of common ground for us to say, well, the other side's rational, and they care about harm. And so we have a bunch of studies. This paper's been downloaded about 100,000 times now, that show that if you just kick off something with like, look, the reason that I believe the way I do on guns is because, I had a friend who got shot in a school shooting, and that just really stuck with me. Or if you say, look, the reason that I'm pro-gun is because someone broke into my house when I was little, and my mom defended herself with a gun. And it's just really important to me because I think it helps protect my family. All of a sudden now, like, you're human, I'm human, we understand the harm that we're kind of perceiving, and that provides a kind of a stepping stone. And there's actually lots of organizations that kind of swap stories or provide those kind of understandings of harm. Relatedly, I think it's important to kind of find balance. And even just if you're just recognizing that the other side just legitimately perceives harm, even if you don't agree, right? You say, I have a hard time kind of understanding how you might think that, right? Because these are my assumptions. But if I kind of believe the things that you believed, then that makes sense, right? And so I understand that you're being rational. And so I guess to kind of like bring it back, part of the issue is you think the other side is irrational, right? They're not smart for believing what they believe. But people are rational in their kind of sets of beliefs, right? Like maybe you think it's irrational not to believe in God because of the majesty and glory of the natural world, whatever, right? Maybe an atheist thinks it's irrational to believe in God because, right, he never comes when you call him, right, to visit. And so, right, there are these like divides and kind of like what we think is like broadly rational. But once you think about like, look, people have different beliefs, people do act rationally within those sets of beliefs, and you have to understand that.
Fantastic. Now, those studies that you mentioned, are those available on the website for Deepest Beliefs Lab and the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding, or are they elsewhere?
They're on the Deepest Beliefs Lab. I don't know if the paper is kind of like really salient. I'm happy to give you the web address. It's open access, so it's downloadable for anybody on the journal website as well.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I will follow up with you afterwards, and we'll make the links to everything available in the program notes. I tried to ask questions that would cover the broad bases in a short period of time. Is there anything that I missed that you would like to say, to get out?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground. We could probably talk for hours. Yeah,
we could. Well, great. I hopefully I find this fascinating. I continue to poke around your websites and look at your papers. In fact, I just got an email this morning about some of your work with colleagues in intellectual humility, which is another area where I have been doing some research and applied for another grant. So I may be in touch with you about that as well. But I just want to thank you for taking the time for the work that you do and helping the audience understand the significance of harm-based morality.
Great. Thanks for having me on. It's been a blast.
My pleasure.